Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing It Came From the Network. Topic of this It Came From the Network, Mid-South Wrestling, marked on Peacock as Season 4, Episode 25, from June 26th of 1982. And the reason why this was selected, as you may have seen in my last It Came From the Network, for the month of February, we're going to highlight Black History Month and cover some historical events in pro wrestling that tie in with Black History Month. For this, I chose this because of the Junkyard Dog basically being on here and an important moment in his career. Also, the show has Ernie Ladd, who was a pioneer and one of the greats of all time that's not really recognized as much as he should be. He takes part in the main event here, or the last match of the show. I wouldn't necessarily call it the main event. You'll see why as we go through this. But like I said, for those two men, two absolute legends, I wanted to bring this up. I wanted to watch this video, and you'll see the exact reason for the Junkyard Dog pretty quickly into this. That being said, if you haven't seen my videos before, I do grade everything on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. We start the show with our commentary team, which is Boyd Pierce and Bill Watts. The second week in a row, we get Bill Watts on the show. They let the fans know that earlier in the week, the Junkyard Dog had beaten Bob Roop for the North American title, which was the biggest title in the company, which is why I wanted to cover this. This was the first time the Junkyard Dog had won that championship. At the time that he had won it, he was also the Louisiana champion, which we'll hear him talk about here in a moment. That is followed up with an interview segment with the Junkyard Dog. He talks about winning the North American Championship and having to drop the Louisiana title because he can't carry both at the same time. That shoots us back to our announce team. They let us know that there was a scheduled match between Ted DiBiase and Bob Roop for the North American Championship. There was going to be a no disqualification match, and if DiBiase lost, he would retire, which shoots us to an interview with Ted DiBiase, who basically says, and continues on with what they were saying, he's still going to get his match, but with the Junkyard Dog. And the Junkyard Dog is his best friend. He was his best man at his wedding. For context, if you're not familiar with this part of Ted DiBiase's career, up until this point in Mid-South, he was an ultra babyface, beloved fan favorite, and him and Junkyard Dog were kind of the two guys that stood up for what's right and were the baby faces of the company. We go from that back to an interview, or basically the same interview with Junkyard Dog, but he's talking more now about his match with DiBiase. The same things are covered, how he was his best man, their best friends, and how when they get in the ring, it's more going to be about business and friendship. So we have an interesting dichotomy already. Just 5 days after he won the championship, the Junkyard Dog is now asked to defend his championship in a match where either his best friend loses his career and he keeps his championship, or he loses that title. The stakes are high. Then we get an interview with Bob Roop. Bob Roop feels like he was cheated out of the championship because Junkyard Dog was a substitution for DiBiase when he lost the title. Again, the stories are all tying together, and Bob Roop wants a rematch. So here we have the current champion, the #1 contender in DiBiase, and the former champion in Bob Roop, all tying into the main storyline. That leads us into our first match of the show, and I'm going to be honest, all these matches are pretty much squash matches. We get Jeff Sword going up against a very young Dr. Death Steve Williams, and I found interesting that they mentioned on commentary that Dr. Death was a 4-time All-American in wrestling, but he was still going to go back to the University of Oklahoma for his senior year for football, which I don't know if he did. I don't know if that was even a thing that you could do. I know the rules with the NCAA back in the day, and pretty much up until now, it just recently changed, was that you couldn't be a professional and come back and play college football. So I don't know, and I didn't research this. I probably should have, but it was kind of interesting. It's kind of cool seeing a very young Dr. Death Steve Williams. I believe he was only about 22 at this time, and I personally wouldn't see Dr. Death until 4 or 5 years later when he showed up on UWF, which is basically a continuation of Mid-South, and when he would show up on the Crockett promotion. I didn't watch Mid-South Wrestling in its original run. All that I've seen of it has been afterwards. As you can imagine, Dr. Death pretty much dominates the match, picks up the win here. I thought this was good even for a squash match. It It let us know right away who Dr. Death was, what he was about. I'm giving this one a 3. I thought it was pretty good. That's followed up with a new tag team to the territory, Big John Studd and the Super Destroyer, and I think this was Scott Irwin. It was either Scott or Bill Irwin. I'm pretty sure it was Scott, though. I might be wrong. As the Super Destroyer, that is. And they're going up against Ernie Kirkland and David Price. This, again, another squash match to put over this new tag team, this heel tag team. They look great, and it's funny how I remember John Studd, because I started seeing John Studd as I started watching wrestling, because he was part of the WWF at the time, very early on, which was the first wrestling company I started watching. And just that 2-3 years later, he looks so much older than he did here. And it could be my brain misremembering how he looked, but even if you look at pictures, like look at pictures of WrestleMania 1, which is 1985, and how he looked there, and look at here, it feels like it's a decade of difference. And I'm just talking about look-wise, not ring-wise. John Studd was a very good big man. Also, Scott or Bill Irwin, they were both good. They would go on to be the Long Riders and have a good run in World-Class Championship Wrestling. I thought this was a good tag team. Then this, again, was another match, highlighted their skills. John Studd and the Super Destroyer pick up the win here. I'm going to give this one another 3. Even though they're squash matches, they're still interesting, and they still kept me involved and kept me to the edge of my seat watching this interested. And I know if you watch this and you go back now and you haven't seen this, the pacing of the matches is a little bit slower than we're used to in the last 20 years or so, which is understandable. This is 40 plus years ago now. But the psychology is there, and that's where I think that Mid-South holds up better than, let's say, WWF of the same time, because the WWF matches aren't as good as these. And that's no knock on the WWF at all. There's just something to be said about the way storytelling was handled in Mid-South and how that storytelling could still work today. Even though the matches would be different, I think you could still take some influence from this. It feels more like an All Japan Pro Wrestling Kings Road style, which makes sense because Dr. Death would go on to dominate in All Japan, and the way the stories were built felt that way. I digress. We go to our next match, which would probably be considered the main event of the show, which I found interesting because they said this is to the time limit remaining. If it goes short, we're going to have standby matches. I like that idea because it kind of feels like UFC does now. UFC, if the main event is a one-round affair or the night goes quickly, there's a lot of fast matches, they have preliminary matches that they put on after the main event, so you get your money's worth, basically. I like that feeling, and it's probably something that ties back into boxing. Again, I don't know the history of it. It's probably something that boxing shows did for years. I can't imagine that when a boxing show would be on television, if the main event was allotted an hour and it only went 10 minutes, that they didn't fill it with other matches, which is probably where Bill Watts got the idea from. And it's probably been something that was in territory wrestling for decades. I digress. This match is the no disqualification match for the North American Championship. We get Ted DiBiase versus the Junkyard Dog. Again, if DiBiase loses, he has to retire. I really enjoyed this match. The way this match was worked, in my opinion, was basically a masterclass, and I say that because the way that they build it up with them being friends, the interviews previously, the way that they start off wrestling, the way the match goes, you get the feeling that this is going to be a fair and even competition, that it's just two friends seeing who's better than the other. We get down to the end of the match, and the ref is out of place. I think there was a ref bump, and DiBiase puts on a glove. All the while, Bob Roop is on commentary. DiBiase hits the Junkyard Dog with the glove hand, which, if you know anything about Ted DiBiase, especially in his Mid-South career, that was kind of his gimmick going forward, the iron glove or whatever they called it, a loaded glove basically. Bob Roop mentions that glove has to be loaded because the Junkyard Dog is not going down with one punch. And the very smart thing they did here, and they even did it going back to Bob Roop's interview, was Roop talked about how he doesn't think DiBiase could beat him, and since he couldn't beat the Junkyard Dog, he knows that DiBiase can't beat the Junkyard Dog, which was a masterclass in how they weaved that into the story. So much of what the story is here is the interviews before and the commentary of Roop and Watts here. Roop says there's no way the Junkyard Dog gets knocked out with one punch unless there's a foreign object. You have a heel who hates the Junkyard Dog, who's feuded with the Junkyard Dog, but he's still giving him the respect he deserves, saying he's the toughest guy he's ever wrestled. DiBiase does pick up the win here, thus ending the Junkyard Dog's first reign as the North American champion. This also ties into the story of he had to give up his Louisiana championship, and he's not going to be involved in the tournament to win that championship because at the time the tournament was announced, he was the North American champ. So this feels like a total screw over of what DiBiase called his best friend and the best man at his wedding. I thought this was all fantastic. I'm going to leave it a little bit short of a 5. I'm going to give it a 4, but I thought it was really great storytelling. Like I said, the show itself, including this, made this story feel so special. And we would see after this, for historical context, DiBiase would go on to be probably the best heel in the history of Mid-South Wrestling and one of the great heels of the 1980s, either in Mid-South or WWF. Just a great showing here. Next up, we had what I would consider as a surprise. We had a video from Madison Square Garden with Andre the Giant sitting down for an interview with Vince McMahon. And if you would have told me that I would see Vince McMahon on this show, that you would see Vince McMahon in Mid-South, I would have said you were crazy. I do believe this was very soon after he bought the company from his father, and there was a time where he was trying to work with other promotions, sharing talent, putting their videos on his TV show. So that makes sense. The story they're telling here is that Andre the Giant had had his foot broken by Killer Khan. And yes, to discuss the elephant in the room before I move on, at the time of this taping, Vince McMahon is very much in turmoil. I'm not going to say much more than that. You all know what's happening. You can look at 1,000 other YouTube videos talking about that. The only reason I'm even bringing him up here is because he's on the video. Anyway, they're talking about the injury that happened, that Andre's healed up. They go to another video within this video, kind of an inception, of a few months earlier where Killer Khan attacked him while he still had his cast on his foot with his manager, Classy Freddie Blassie. I thought this was all really good, and I know the territories would do this. They would share videos of a wrestler that was newer to the territory or coming into the territory so they could introduce him, and that makes sense with what we talk about next. They do mention on commentary that there is going to be a matchup between Andre the Giant and Killer Khan in Mid-South, which I imagine happened at a lot of different places, and I know it happened in WWF. I want to say it happened in Pensacola and Memphis as well. I know it happened in a couple different places to sell this story, because Andre the Giant was such a big star that his story carried everywhere. That's followed up with a match. We get Joe Stark, no relation to Tony, going up against Killer Khan. Killer Khan's contract was sold to Skandar Akbar, who was a big heel manager in Mid-South, because obviously Freddie Blassie, he's going to stay in the WWF, as it was common at the time. Nice little storytelling that. I did like this match. I thought it was a great way to show off Killer Khan. Killer Khan had a more fast pace than what we see on any of the rest of these matches, a more aggressive style, which kind of makes sense. If you watch this, it's kind of similar to if you go to the same time period, a Bruiser Brody or a Mongolian Stomper, they would have very similar matches to this. Usually your violent, dangerous heel would wrestle in this fashion. This again is just a highlight match for Killer Khan. I did think it was interesting. I'm giving this one a 3 as well. Next up, we have Buck Robley versus Billy Starr. Buck Robley, one of the big stars in the history of Mid-South Wrestling. And I want to mention this because you can probably see it here, and you'll definitely see it in a little bit again. Take a look at Buck Robley. I miss seeing wrestlers like that. I miss that guys like that could be a big star in a promotion. And this isn't a knock on Buck Robley. He just felt so real. He felt like the guy you could see at the bar, or the guy that lived down the street from you, or your friend's dad that you knew was a tough guy. He just had that feeling to him. Unfortunately, this was probably my least favorite match on the show. Buck Robley picks up an easy win because, again, that's what this is here. I'm giving this one a 2. Probably the only match on here I wouldn't want to watch again. All the rest I would watch again. I'm not saying they'd be my favorite matches, but they're all watchable. This one, not so much. And as you can see here now, look at Buck. He just looks awesome. And I know that contradicts with the rating I gave the match, but that's a great look. Then we get to the last match of the show, which is scheduled to be the one-man gang and the grappler. They're going against Tom Jones. It's not unusual to be loved by anyone. No, it's not that Tom Jones. And he's teaming up with the big cat, Ernie Ladd. Again, I mentioned earlier in the show, Ernie Ladd was involved in the last match. The one-man gang and the grappler have the assassin with him, which there have been so many assassins, I don't know which one this was. It may have been Jody Hamilton. I'm thinking it's either Jody Hamilton or Roger Smith that was this assassin, because he kind of fits either of those. The assassin basically says, let's make this a six-man match. Let's settle our score here. Assassin was supposed to go up against Ernie Ladd at a show earlier in the week, and that fell apart. He tells them to go get a partner. He knows that the Junkyard Dog is probably in the back, still suffering from injuries from earlier. So Tom Jones and Ernie Ladd go to the back, and they bring out our friend, Buck Robley. And this is just basically a brawl with the last 3 or 4 minutes of the TV show. It's one of those things that would happen a lot back in the territory wrestling days. They would have a match that would basically go to the end of the time limit and then end as a draw because it's just a feud or it's just a brawl there. I thought this was fun and interesting, a nice way to end up the show. Cool to see the one-man gang with hair. He has long, straight hair, which is amazing to see him back in those days. The grappler, Len Denton, a guy that, again, much like other people I've mentioned here, gets kind of forgotten by time, but he was a great wrestler. The assassin, depending on which one it was part of one of the legendary tag teams of all time. Tom Jones, I'm not as familiar with. I know his name, and again, he's not the singer. Ernie Ladd, absolute legend. Buck Robley, a legend in the Mid-South. This did go to a draw as the show went off the air. I thought it was fun. I thought it was interesting. I'm giving it a 3. Overall, I thought this was a good show. It did encompass what I think some of the strengths of Mid-South wrestling were. The grappling-based, sport-based presentation. I mentioned this when I talked about the WCW show last week that was run by Bill Watts as well, how Bill Watts had a way to make his shows feel more like a sport. And it was here. It was very evident here. That's what he was going for. I enjoyed this. The reason I picked it, as you could probably guess, is it's Junkyard Dog's first North American title win. Also having Ernie Ladd involved in the show. 2 of the legends in wrestling, and 2, when I think of historic black wrestlers, 2 of the people that come up right off the top of my head. I thought this was an enjoyable show. I would definitely recommend checking it out. Overall, I'm going to give it a 3. The match quality, like I said, it's all squash matches, so I can't really give it a better score than that. You have 2 matches, the end match, which I don't want to call the main event because they have a championship match in the middle of the card, which would be the main event. Those 2 matches had consequence, and they felt important. And I know it's a different time, but it's hard to go back and look at that after 30 years now of seeing matches that have consequences with name talent in them. It's hard to go back and watch squash matches and think of them as anything special. Hence why this doesn't get a much better rating than a 3 from me. I do enjoy it. I do recommend you checking it out. I think Mid-South Wrestling is one of the best territories of all time. It's one of the great hotbeds for what would be the stars of the decade. You know, Dr. Death, Ted DiBiase, Junkyard Dog, One Man Gang. I mean, you have wrestlers that would go on to main event in several different companies here. Plus you have established stars like Ernie Ladd, Bob Roop here, Buck Robley at the time. So this was a fun show. I enjoyed it. Like I said, I recommend checking it out. With all that being said, if you made it here to the end, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. You see where it says join? That's how you become a channel member. Becoming a channel member definitely helps out. If you made it here, let's throw a grab them cakes in the comments. If you remember the Junkyard Dog, that was his theme song, or one of his theme songs in the WWE. So let's throw grab them cakes in the comments. With that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another It Came From The Network.